I was recently asked in a question in one of the videos if I could recommend a decent source of information online about where people could look to buy property here in Paraguay. I couldn't recommend anywhere, whether it's a website or a social media platform. There's not one single source of information online in respect to the sale of properties that I would recommend to anyone as being a reliable source. There are a myriad of reasons why the information that you will find online will often be misleading, untrue, inflated. There's all sorts of different variations of why information that you will find online is either unreliable or completely erroneous. I guess for completeness, I should follow up by saying, well, if anyone was to ask me where or how they may go about looking for a property for sale here in Paraguay, there is a certain process that I would recommend if people are in a position to do so. The first thing that I would highly recommend, if at all possible, is for people to identify where it actually is in Paraguay that they would like to live. Now, it would be fair to ask, well, how can I know where I want to live if I haven't possibly been to Paraguay? Well, it depends what your criteria is. For example, we had a list of requirements of any place that we were to settle in that we could assess before we even came to the country. In our case, we didn't actually do that because we weren't really sure what we were going to find here in Paraguay. But now looking back on it, if I was making an inquiry like this chap has, well, it seems that he's formulated perhaps a more certain state of mind that he's at least looking seriously. Well, if you're looking seriously, then I would highly recommend that you just think about what are your non-negotiables. Take my family. One of our non-negotiables is that we didn't want to be around mass cropping, places where they're just growing hectares and hectares of one particular crop, and that's repeated year after year. It was just something we didn't want to be having to deal with. So it's quite simple to be able to do an analysis of this country and come up with certain departments. And what you'll find is that in a very brief period of time of looking, you'll see that the area that you may be interested in is pretty much confined to a few certain departments. I've spoken about that in a previous video where I talked about why it was that we chose the region of Cordillera where we are now. You can go check out that video. There's also a link to a website that talks about areas around Paraguay where certain mass crops are placed. So you can do your own analysis on that before you even hop on a plane. And if that's not negotiable for you, well, you're ahead of the curve straight away because there are so many lovely areas around this country that nonetheless will expose you to some of those negative elements that come along with mass cropping. Another thing that you might be able to identify before you come here, or at least assess, is how strongly do you feel about being near the capital, Asuncion? Well, this may be something that you can only fully assess once you get here, but I can say that in Paraguay, we find it to be of great benefit to be in a decent shooting distance of the capital. It's not uncommon that we do travel there for various reasons. There are a lot of things that are pretty much only available there or that we're able to find. And apart from that, it's just nice to be close to the capital and just being able to access it, we believe, is a real benefit and something that was high on our list of priorities. Without coming to the country, you can assess that, and that may narrow your field of interest in respect to the regions that you might be interested in settling in. See? I don't know what I've got in store for me here. So doing an assessment of where you want to settle as much as you possibly can is a really good starting point, because take for example mass cropping. You could spend a ton of time online looking at all sorts of forums and finding ideal properties. But what's the point if down the track you decide that that's an aspect that's really important to you? You would have been better to have done that initially, so you've got that out of the way. So the next thing that I would say is very important, and I don't think you can really get around it, is that you need to come here. You need to actually spend time in the place you're thinking about settling in and perhaps buying a property. There's no shortcut. You can read things online, you can hear other people's opinions. It doesn't matter what the source of information is. There is no substitute for coming and looking yourself, experiencing it. Because we have been to many places where we've heard all sorts of things, both here in Paraguay and elsewhere, and what we saw just didn't gel with what you commonly hear about those places. That might have just been our perception, and that's the way life goes. My opinion is different to someone else's. But when you're talking about looking for property and possibly settling somewhere, you can't substitute time on the ground, because time on the ground leads to the next very important stage of the process that I would highly recommend people think about employing when looking for property in Paraguay. In our case, we looked online for quite some time when we came to Paraguay, and we followed many rabbits down holes and went down many dead ends before we actually concluded that online wasn't the best place to find a viable property. In the meantime, we met people and made friends here, and ultimately it was through friends who we had met to another friend who came up with an option that turned out to be the property that we purchased. It was only through a relationship that we developed here that we were able to find a property at a good price that was legitimately for sale and being sold by decent people who didn't have some sort of ulterior motive, and were able to get the job done. What that also did was it allowed us to negotiate with these people in a spirit of kind of friendship, because Paraguay is the country of friends. The place runs on relationship. So what it allowed us to do was to talk to the people who are selling the property without having to be under the pressure of being just people that they had sourced from online. And we had some particular requirements that were in place in respect to how we wanted the purchase to go, because we were adamant that we were going to sufficiently protect ourselves. And at least one of the clauses that we were quite set on was not altogether regular when it comes to buying property here in Paraguay. It wasn't unknown, but it's not something that is done every day. In the case of this purchase, it wasn't a problem, because these people knew that we were serious. They had some understanding of our background. Their friends vouched for us. So they had the confidence of knowing that we weren't just tire kickers. The sale went through without a hitch. We're still good friends with these people, and it was just a delightful process to go through. No hassle whatsoever. So it really underscored to us that regardless of all of the rabbits that we chased down all of those holes, it was ultimately just through association, through a friend who knew somebody who happened to have a property for sale, that we were able to actually get the job done. So I guess there's many and varying ways you could also go about finding a property, but that's just a pretty simple step-by-step process that if people are at a loss as to how they might go about it, I think that's a fairly solid option. And when you develop relationships, you also are availed with the intel of the location that you're interested in. Say, for example, if I said, hey, I think Carcupe or Atira or San Bernardino or wherever else, that's a good place to head. Well, a lot of people might just say, well, cool, we'll go to those places and find a nice house and we're off and away. But just like any place in the world, there's parts of Carcupe that I would say you wouldn't want to live there. And that's no different to any town that I've ever lived in. How are you going to know that unless you've made those contacts? There's no shortcut to making friendships, relationships, and getting the best advice before you make the big decision. I'm not saying that it's impossible to find a good property online and for you to live happily ever after. Some people have managed to do that. They've found a property on a website and somehow it's worked for them. All I'm saying is that there are so many false starts that it will be quite lucky for you if that comes off. The truth is that any real estate website, the properties will be significantly overpriced if you were to compare those prices to what you should be reasonably paying in a given area. I've seen properties that have been for sale through word of mouth, so they've been for sale but they haven't been advertised, and as soon as one of the major real estate agents has picked it up as a listing, they've immediately loaded thousands and thousands of dollars onto the price simply because it's now on their books. It's not only uncommon, it's normal. So the chances of finding a property listed on a real estate website that I would suggest you should be looking at in terms of the price point be pretty rare. It may occur on the odd occasion, but if it does, it's going to really stick out on their website because it's going to be next to a whole lot of other properties that are significantly overpriced. And just while I talk, this is the Chepa man. It's their little mandioca breads that they deliver around the place. You hear that at all times of the day and night. There's also little motorbikes that get around and they've got the same fella blaring away on their loudspeaker. So there it is to that chap who wanted to know how to find real estate online. Sorry, I haven't got a straightforward answer in that regard, but in place of that, I hope that this advice is at least in some way useful to you. And if it's not this process, you might come up with your own. There might be, and definitely would be, other ways of going about it. That I think you have to have some sort of process. We're not buying pretzels here. We want to make sure that whatever we put in regards to our investment, that at least we've gone through a relatively robust method of securing our funds. But that's just my opinion, and everyone has their own. So it's about all I've got to say about that. We'll all make the decisions based on how we do our business. The only final thing I would say is that when you're thinking about doing something as major as buying real estate, it's a really good process to reconsider everything that you know and everything about the way that you've done things in the place that you are at, and just put a fresh set of goggles on and don't take anything for granted. Because I've seen people way smarter than me come and make some bad decisions that unfortunately will be with them for life. Not infrequently is a consequence of people thinking that it's just another day at the office, and it's not. A place like Paraguay presents a vastly different reality in so many ways that it not infrequently delivers what we call the Paraguay punch. The Paraguay punch we've seen more than a few people on the wrong end of, and it's pretty much a consequence of just assuming that you know everything. And when you assume that you know everything, or at least most of what you need to know, well, the Paraguay punch will usually come out of nowhere and just remind you that maybe you just need to reassess how good you think you are. But it's everyone's learning journey, and I've been on the end of the odd Paraguay punch, probably more like a slap, maybe a tap, because a full-on punch is just like another thing, but enough to sort of get a wake-up call, enough to remind me that, hey, you're not quite as smart as you think you are. And I've appreciated those little lessons. So that's all I've got to say about that. And until next time, take care. Ciao.
Smoke